I used to have to travel to the city to play D&D at a game store. For a while, it was great, started with Lost Mines of Phandelver, after which I was handed the torch of being a DM. There are a few horror stories I could tell from there, but the biggest annoyance was the store rule of can't say no to anyone wanting to join your game. On paper, this seemed like a good rule to avoid groups from rejecting new players, but what it turned into was a group of 10 plus people at one table. I tried techniques to cope with this, such as having a co-DM and pairing players together in combat so they could do combination moves and share initiative, but it was still a nightmare to get through every night. Not to mention, having to fight the in-store volume from the other tables and card games happening at the same time. Eventually, I decided that no D&D was better than coming back home exhausted and with a sore throat from trying to get the other players to hear me. Man, needing to scream over multiple 10-person games in order to get your D&D party to hear what you're saying so you can play the game? A game that relies on communication and talking? Wow, that sounds like the dream. Obligatory, this happened a few years ago, yada yada, you know the rest. Flagging this as NSFW just in case because, spoilers, somebody makes a joke about boners later. So full disclosure, I am a cisgendered man, but sometimes I play as a female player character at the table. There's usually not a whole lot of thought behind why I do this, other than this character concept feels like it would be more interesting if they were a woman. Most of the time, I'm playing with a group of people who don't really care if your character's pronouns don't match your own, so nobody bats an eye. This was not one of those times. I mean, obviously, or else I'd be posting this in a different sub. So at the time of this story, I had a friend of a friend who wanted to know if I'd be interested in joining his homebrew 5th edition game with 2 other players. The Pathfinder game I had been DMing had just recently dried up, and I was pretty eager to jump into a new game, so I said sure. I show up with a Hexblade Warlock, which, for the uninitiated, is a class/subclass combo where basically all of your abilities are tied to Charisma. I like the idea of a single stat-dependent character because I'm a mid-maxer, and for no particular reason, I decided this Warlock was going to be a woman named Lydia. Lydia's backstory was simple, a lowly urchin with less than 2 copper coins to her name. She found a magic sword in the woods one day and has been living paycheck to paycheck as a traveling sellsword ever since. And also worth mentioning is that Lydia was a tiefling, a race with not very well-liked reputation by the general public in this setting, but I picked it anyway because they get +2 charisma, and I'm a min-maxer. And so she makes a habit to try and fit in with the human folk by filing down her horns, Hellboy style, and wearing baggy, concealing clothing to cover up her bright purple skin and tail. If all that sounds like needless fluff unrelated to the story at hand, I only bring up Lydia's backstory and physical appearance to provide context for when I talk about the DM, who proceed to ignore all of the above. Right from the start, the DM would have NPCs constantly shower Lydia with compliments and praise for her beauty and feminine grace, despite the fact that she was dressed like Kenny from South Park at all times and attempted to hide her obvious tieflingness. I tried pushing back against this narrative by really leaning into Lydia's frumpy and extremely androgynistic fashion sense. I'd take every opportunity to describe how she would wrap herself up in multiple bulky layers of clothing, regardless of temperature, how she'd always be shopping for large hats and scarves to cover as much of her face as possible, and how she'd always use male disguises for her mask and many face ability, etc. In retaliation, the DM would force the party into situations where Lydia would have no choice but to put on a feminine side on full display, even in situations where it wouldn't make much sense at all. At this point, all the prior lore I had been told about the setting's anti-tiefling prejudice had been thrown out the window, which conveniently freed up all the human NPCs to ogle at my character's exotic skin and shapely curves. Again, picture a thrift store coat rack holding a sword. That's my character. For some reason, I just didn't quit the game at this point, probably because my brain is as smooth as an egg, and I still want to be part of the campaign, even if it meant being imaginary eye candy for the horniest storyteller since Tarantino. At this point, I forget some of the details, but basically, our party had to infiltrate a members-only tavern and shake down a specific patron for info on our upcoming quest. Turns out that this tavern, surprise, has a very rigid dress code, which meant that Lydia would get turned away at the door. Unless, of course, she was wearing a dress. Being the good sport I am, I described Lydia getting all glowed up at the local dressmaker, but kept the actual description of my new outfit pretty vague. Unfortunately, the DM was more than happy to fill in the blanks on Lydia's new appearance. I'm trying to remember the exact phrasing of his description, but it makes me black out a little bit. I'm pretty sure the word bosom came up at least once, possibly preceded by heaving.
That's her heaving bosom? What do you want me to say?
So anyway, we're in the tavern and oh look, there's our Mark drinking at a table in the corner with a bunch of his NPC bandit buddies. Now's our chance. Okay, so Lydia is going to disguise herself as one of the servers so she can get close and try to listen in on the conversation. The DM responds,
"As you get closer, one of the bandits at the table puts his arm around your waist and pulls you in closer. 'Hello, love,' he says. 'Why not take a seat in my lap and we can discuss the first thing that comes up?'"
That was the boner joke, by the way. I hope it was worth the wait, and you enjoyed it more than we did when we first heard it at the table, which was not at all. At this point, the DM tells me that if I want to seduce this NPC for info, then I can roll for persuasion with advantage. What? No, that was not the plan. I just want to spy on them. What makes you think I wanted to seduce any of these guys?
"You're playing a girl with high charisma. Isn't this what you wanted when you made this character?"
I forgot what happened after that. I think the party barbarian started a bar brawl as a distraction to bail me out. Total bro move, thanks man. But I do remember that this was my last session with this group. Turns out the DM had a pretty narrow understanding of what a female character in fantasy fiction could look and act like, and assumed the only reason I would roleplay a woman is that I'd have something to visualize during my special tissue time TM after the game. TLDR, I thought I was entering my DM's magical realm. Turns out he thought we were in my magical realm this whole time. Also, general misogyny. Misogyny in RPG horror stories. A dream combo, to be sure. Now, this is definitely unfortunate. I am also a person who plays characters that aren't like me, and sometimes that means playing a character of a different gender. I still, to this day, do not understand what people get out of doing stuff like this. Is this enjoyable to people, to basically harass a player into living out a fantasy that they don't want to be a part of? Well, I suppose so. I still won't understand it, ever, at least I don't think so, even after reading so many of these. It's bad, guys. Don't do this. Not fun, not good. If somebody has a vision for their character, help them to realize that vision. Don't try to enforce your own vision upon them. Never good, especially if you're the DM. Hello, and thank you for taking the time to read this story. The story is about the time a friend of mine attempted to convert me into his and his friend's kinks. A small disclaimer before I proceed. I am a very live and let live kind of person. As long as you're not hurting anyone, power to you and being into whatever you like. My problem is when you try to force it onto others. As soon, you'll see. Our cast is as follows. The DM, an acquaintance of mine who I met through a different friend. Rogue, a player who was a little too keen engaging in their fetish. Bard, a mostly normal player and not very important to the story, and myself as myself. It is quite rare for me to get the chance to play Dungeons & Dragons, so when my friend the DM messaged me and asked me to join his game, it took little to convince me. The game, as he explained it to me, would be a Monster Hunter-inspired game played with 5th edition rules and heavy homebrew from a book he found online. The game was described as having a lot of exploration and combat as per a Monster Hunter game. I accepted and rolled up a ranger. I didn't know any of the other players as they were all friends of the DM and I wasn't even that close to the DM. Something I noticed was a bit odd is that the rogue was playing as a palico. For those of you who don't play Monster Hunter, a palico is basically a cat that walks on 2 legs. It's not even some kind of bipedal humanoid cat like a tabaxi. They are really just cats. They walk on 2 legs though. But the portrait the player was using for his character was a lot different than the palicos I know from the game. One with much more exaggerated proportions, such as ridiculously wide hips and large breasts on an actual cat. I was a bit put off to say the least, but I figured no harm, no foul. Maybe he just liked the art for some reason. And thus the game began. The game at first was, for the most part, normal. We were all part of an expedition intent on settling on a new continent akin to Monster Hunter World. In the first session, the DM had us all choose as a party our mentor, an NPC who would basically advise us and give us goodies as the game progressed. The DM presented a few NPCs to us, and one of them was very different from the rest. Said NPC was what was essentially some kind of humanoid lizard woman with large breasts and a very bubbly and ditzy attitude who was supposed to be some kind of legendary hunter. When I say lizard, I mean full-on green scales around her body, a tail, the works. As a bit of context, this game was supposed to take place in the Monster Hunter setting, where something like that is very much not typical. And when we as the party did not choose this NPC, the DM seemed disappointed and asked us in an annoyed tone if we were sure, and even had this lizard lady approach us and try to convince us to take her instead. Feeling pressured, we just reluctantly agreed. We all landed on the new continent and went to our barracks where we got to meet each other a little more in character and meet our new NPC guide, the lizard lady. This is where another red flag popped up. The rogue, in character, mentioned that she liked to draw hentai of people she met and found attractive, which included my character. The lizard lady NPC piped in and mentioned how she thought that was a great talent and asked the rogue to make hentai of my character and the lizard lady together, mentioning how cute she thought my character was. I felt awkward because of the situation. I tend to like romance in games where they developed naturally, of course, and raunchy stuff doesn't tend to knock me off balance. The thing is, I was and am not a furry. I just don't want that kind of thing. After taking a moment to gather my thoughts, I just had my character say how she would prefer not to be depicted in whatever this hentai was and how she had better use of her time than to get together with someone who was supposed to train them. Neither the rogue nor the DM seemed to like this response, but things moved on either way, and we all finished getting to know each other. As the sessions progressed, it became more and more obvious the game was not what was advertised. I am not kidding nor exaggerating when I say 70% of all sessions were our characters and the NPC lizard lady role-playing having breakfast, lunch, and dinner, just talking about stuff, with the lizard lady constantly trying to flirt with my ranger. It was fun at first. I like to roleplay as much as the next person, but I also like rolling dice and smashing heads, neither of which was happening. Finally, it was just about time to head out on our first hunt. I was very excited. I thought maybe the game would finally kick off, but I was a bit nervous with what we were hunting, a Mitsune. For those of you who don't play the game, the Mitsune is basically this big, colorful water snake fluffy thing that shoots bubbles. It's not very threatening sounding, but we were level 3 at the time, and the DM had shown us the homebrew bestiary book he found for Monster Hunter creatures, and the Mitsune was way beyond our capabilities. However, it soon became evident why we were sent out to find a Mitsune first out of all things. As I mentioned before, the monster is a big, colorful, fluffy, bubble lizard snake thing. When we found it, which was nothing more than just me rolling survival, the DM describing us stumbling upon the creature, it was not what I was expecting. It was a Mitsune alright, but the portrait the DM used for it was fan art, one with breasts, long lashes, and a far less frightening appearance than in the game, and one that could perhaps most surprisingly of all, speak. We ended up talking to it, as it apparently didn't want to fight us, and we weren't too happy fighting something that could kill us with great ease, and wouldn't you know it, it was flirtatious. It made comments about how its slippery body produced great lubricant, and how its bubbles weren't the only big round things she would like to... Oh my god. The other things that hurt to remember, blah blah blah. The worst part of all, we found the plot to the game thanks to this stupid thing. Turns out it was mating season for most monsters, and they were all on a rampage trying to find a mate before the season ended. I honestly tapped out at this point. Something you have to understand is that this game was not advertised as one with adult content, nor was it ever mentioned to me things of that sort would be present, especially not the furry-centric kind. I just kept quiet and waited for the session to end. When it did, I spoke to my friend the DM and asked him about everything that has been going on, including the particular plot he chose for this game he was running. His response has still baffled me to this day. The DM told me that he was struggling a lot to find a player for his game, and he knew how I never get to play, and while he knew I was not interested in furries or anything surrounding them, he thought I just need to experiment with them and they would grow on me. When I asked him about the mature content, he just gave me a similar response. The DM told me he knew I would not join if I knew it was a furry game with 18 plus elements, so he hoped that by withholding that information from me, I would learn to enjoy said elements as the game progressed and just have a fun game with everybody. In the end, the DM, who was a proud furry, did not understand that he did anything wrong. I really was not interested in this type of game, so I thanked the DM for his time, bid him good luck, and never returned again. TLDR. Furry DM lies to me about his game and hopes I convert into being a furry after playing it. Look, I don't understand any of this stuff, but from what I do understand, you don't just become into something by rhetorical inertia. Look, if you are going to play a D&D game, being upfront with what kind of content is in your game is top priority, even outside of 18 plus stuff. All types of content. I am very upfront with everything about my game. Obviously, I'm not spoiling stuff in the story because that kind of ruins the fun for me and the players, but as upfront as I can be about the elements of my game, my playstyle, the way I run, the setting, everything is included. I try to cram as much information in Session 0 as I can without making the player's head explode. Life is short, D&D is long. People don't have time to play a game that they're just not going to enjoy. Look, D&D is one of the most subjective things. If you're into this type of game, there's nothing wrong with that, but you need to make sure everybody is down and be upfront. This DM has made a cardinal sin by hiding the content of their game to try to lure people in order to get players. That is incredibly crappy to an unbelievable degree. It's manipulative, rude, and just kind of gross. Look, if you want to play this type of game, I'm not going to stop. If you're a furry and you want to play a furry game, go right ahead, but find fellow players who want that kind of game too, and don't bait people into it. Though I hope and think most people already understand that. Next story. I'll keep this one as short as I can, and I'll preface at least by saying that it wasn't as horrifying as many of the stories here. It still led to the end of the campaign though, at least for myself and my particular group of friends. Several years ago, I was in an open D&D 5th edition group at an FLGS, which anyone could join by signing up, a campaign with no particular Session 0, where we were just told to bring characters of a certain level and given a list of permitted spells that existed in the campaign setting. Wizards and sorcerers were particularly hit hard with this axe, with a lot of spells that allowed for creative solutions to encounters no longer being permitted, and mostly only straight damage and buff spells remained. While this was a bit annoying and not really my style, it wasn't a horror story yet. It wasn't the horror story part, but this fact, it will become relevant later. Therefore, I choose to play a paladin. I hadn't been one in 5th edition before, and other than a couple of oaths being banned from the campaign, they were relatively unscathed from the banhammer of spells. Due to the lack of a Session 0 though, this meant that we had two paladins, the other, and the significant character in the story, being a dragonborn paladin. The other characters in the party weren't important except that all of them were playing in more supportive gameplay roles, a druid who liked to heal and steal things several years before Critical Role's Fern existed, and a bard who likes to buff, so on. The two paladins were our main combatants and main damage dealers. Immediately, we found out that the Dragonborn Paladin was deeply competitive. In Session 1, he insisted on PvP dueling every member of the party to find out who was strongest, including my own Paladin, and having beaten me and everyone else, he declared himself the party leader by virtue of his strength, rather elatedly. Given what happened later, I shudder to think what would have happened if he lost this fight in hindsight. I had thought that would be the end of it. But it was not, because the Dragonborn Paladin made it a habit of challenging half of the NPCs we met to duels as well, in order to establish superiority in his interactions with them. Notably, these challenges were only ever issued to NPCs who were clearly weaker than him, including shopkeepers and the like, and they refused, of course, but then he would just scoff and act superior towards them the entire time, often scuppering positive relationships we might have been able to get with that NPC with his challenges and his haughty attitude. Just a character quirk, I thought and hoped. This intense competitiveness continued, and it wasn't just an in-character trait, like I thought, but came from the player himself. He would become visibly angry and jokingly make threats against other players who stole my kills, or rolled higher damage numbers than him that round, and absolutely seethed in silence but visible annoyance if his attacks missed, or an enemy succeeded in a save against him on his turn. Over time, his main character syndrome grew worse. He was always eager to speak up and introduce himself as the leader, often interrupting any other players and talking over them to do so, and take over conversations with the NPCs. My own paladin was a more humble person and dedicated to being more good than self-aggrandizing, and this was both mechanically and roleplay-wise. I got bored of being the other paladin in the group, so it was at this point I switched to playing an evocation wizard, one of the few non-banned wizard archetypes in this campaign along with aberration, and the real problems, they began here. My new character, from an in-character perspective, was not humble at all, and took a lot of initiative in taking actions to advance our goals without consulting the self-appointed leader of the group. This made things go from fine until something happens to him being icy at all times. But it intensified. As I mentioned earlier, the spell list has been pruned down to remove a lot of crowd control or otherwise clever solution options in favor of leaving in buffs and damage spells. That's it. So my options in combat revolved around basically casting haste on somebody, generally the Dragonborn Paladin as he felt entitled to it, and then standing in the back chucking fireballs without any of the crowd control or other things I might usually do. Well, because my damage numbers casting endless fireball spells were higher than the Paladin's damage doing smites, he got mad. I started getting glares across the table and passive-aggressive comments from the guy. The Dragonborn's dice started to be sometimes flung at the table instead of rolled, sometimes knocking back miniatures on the mat. I had declined his requests for a PvP duel, which probably hadn't helped. By this stage, I just wanted as little interaction with him as possible. Eventually, after a particularly high-rolling fireball in the first round against a large group of enemies who had all clustered up, the Paladin stormed off out of the store, and one of the other players, a friend of mine, had to follow and check on him. The game paused, and eventually he returned. The tantrums had stopped, but the sullenness, refusal to speak or to interact with me, and acting out an obvious annoyance whenever my wizard outshone him in any way, especially in terms of damage dice, all remained. We were all sat at the table, but the party had pretty much already split, and the game simply wasn't fun anymore for anyone given the atmosphere. I decided to stop going. My friends in the group decided the same shortly after, and the campaign folded. Getting upset over damage numbers of all things is so absolutely ridiculous, I can barely even fathom it. This is a cooperative role-playing game of all things. Come on, you're meant to be working together to tell a great story. It's one of my favorite aspects of Dungeons & Dragons. D&D parties can get really ride or die sometimes in terms of the tone and how they work together as a team. And this is the complete antithesis of that. Working against your party to prove that you're the alpha best is just absolutely ridiculous to me, especially when the other players are not enjoying it. If you enjoyed this episode of RPG Horror Stories and want to let me know, then please do hit that like button. If you want to see more of my content, we also have a Q&A series where I play video games and answer your questions. And if you want to see this content right when it comes out, then please do subscribe to Crispy's Tavern so you can be here right when the video uploads. Really helps me out. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down into the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment max damage to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I'm going to go join CritCrab to watch The Legend of Vox Machina, and I will see you all next time. Farewell.